Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 242 for Theories in Research and Personality. Today we're going to go over Chapter 5, which is still talking about the psychoanalytic approach. However, now we're moving on to some different theorists who have kind of come from Freudian theory. So a couple quick announcements, nothing too special other than, keep up with the materials. My office hours are the same as always, and the one thing to note here, though, is that your exam will open, I should say, the day that class is for you this coming week, so the day that we talk about this lecture, and you have a full week to take the exam. And it can be taken any time before our next class, before we talk about Chapter 6. However, do recognize that the exam is going to be in two parts, a closed answer or your multiple choice, etc. questions, as well as an essay portion of the exam. Those are not going to be in the same exam. Well, they are, but they're going to be in two separate kind of exam files, you would call it, or like tests that you take on Blackboard. So that way you can do the multiple choice questions first, if you so choose, and take a break, relax, don't have to worry about it for a day or two, and then do the other half, the essay questions. Or reverse, you can do the essay questions first, and then the multiple choice questions. However, you do have that freedom to have some time between those two sets of questions, and to do them in which order you choose. Now, if you have any questions about anything, we can talk about it during class, or you can feel free to come by office hours, etc., and I'm happy to go over things with you. But let's go ahead and talk about what we are actually chatting about this week. And so this week, we're still talking about psychoanalysis, but we're going to kind of move beyond Freud. So first things we're going to do is we're going to talk about the limits and liabilities that the Freudian theory really has, which we've already kind of discussed some of them, but we'll go over this again. And then we're going to talk about four specific theorists, all of which that people in psychology should relatively be familiar with. We've got Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, Erik Erikson, and Karen Horney, as I've learned it's pronounced. We're going to talk about the personal narratives approach to one way that we can study personality research and psychoanalysis. And then we'll spend some time talking about some strengths and criticisms. Nothing too big, just a couple quick, short summary slides. But do recognize we are talking now about not just one theorist, but four. Well, let's talk about the limits and liabilities in Freudian theory, because we know there are some, right? We know that this idea is that with Freudian theory, that personality is pretty much finished growing by 6 years old. And what we call the neo-Freudians, or the people who kind of came from Freud or new or post-Freud, argued that actually, there's a lot more that matters to us that are important in shaping our personality. Like you probably know, it wasn't just the first 6 years of your life that shaped your personality, but there are likely other factors that happened along the way. And what we know is that Freud failed to recognize the importance of social and cultural forces, right? So he was very focused on the self and kind of what happened to the self, but not really focused on the culture or the environment or how, other people other than our parents shape us. And so when we think about this, the other problem that we have is that Freud's tone is kind of negative about how people are. And I don't want to say that he thought people were bad, but he thought people were just kind of controlled by their impulses and just these unconscious things. And as somebody put it in the class before, and I really liked it, right, that basically that we're nothing more than our kind of impulses, and it's just like a lizard brain that's controlling us. So that's not exactly the greatest way to think about it, and from Freudian theory came some different theories of psychology. As it says in the book, a lot of these came about because of arguments with Freud, who was pretty controlling over his own psychoanalysis in general, and people who didn't believe him or argued, maybe said, hey, I think it might be a little different, were treated not necessarily as somebody who was giving a different perspective, but as somebody who was almost treasonous to psychoanalysis. So a lot of people ended up breaking off from Freudian theory. One of the first of which to do was Alfred Adler. So Alfred Adler broke off of psychoanalysis, technically, still, from the psychoanalytic, how would you say that? From that kind of same lineage. But he started focusing on individual psychology, right? How the personality of a specific person matters. And one of the biggest contributions he had is this idea of striving for superiority, or this idea that we always want to be doing better and be superior. He also talked about the role of parental influence on personality development beyond Freud's just kind of ideas of psychosexual development and maybe some defense mechanisms. And he talked a lot about birth order, which is very controversial to this day, and I think we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. But first, let's jump into this idea of striving for striving for superiority. What was interesting, though, about this idea of striving for superiority, which he describes as the single motivating force that can subsume or kind of overcome all other motives, is based on how Adler grew up, in the sense that Adler grew up kind of the runt of the litter, you could call him, and that he really strove to be the best in what he did because he didn't maybe have natural strength or talent because of some of the things he did. So it's also worth just kind of thinking in the back of your mind, what did these psychologists or people go through in their lives that they took and brought into their own theories? And as we'll see, this kind of is a pattern throughout. But the idea is that we have this idea that we want to strive for superiority, right? We start our lives as babies, right? We have no kind of ability to do much of anything. We are weak, we are small, we are helpless. And that eventually we want to overcome that weakness, and we want to be able to maybe master our environment or the world around us. And that is going to be this idea of trying to just figure out how to become superior or strive for superiority in everything you do. But if we end up feeling too guilty, like we can't do that, we might get what Freud calls an inferiority complex, right? And so this idea is that maybe you can become subsumed or overwhelmed with this idea that you are unable to be superior at any one given thing. And this might lead to this inferiority complex, thinking, oh, I'm just terrible and I can't do well. And what was interesting about this is that, if we know about their social interests or how they are in a social setting, combined with, how well they're striving, this is a very good measure, Adler talked about, of determining mental health in an individual. So this makes a lot of sense because, well, if people are being social and having some kind of friendships and they're not seemingly like just the worst kind of people on earth, they are going to probably have some good mental health. And that's something I think that's really important to understand there. But not only that, Adler talked a lot about the parental influence on personality development and the idea that, there are some things that parents can do that leads to problems in a children's life. One of those things, Adler claimed as pampering, or this idea of kind of spoiling a child, where this is going to rob the child of their independence and it makes them maybe feel inferior. Right? So if you've never had to learn how to do anything for a day in your life, and now you are dropped off on your own, you're probably going to feel inferior to the other people around you who know these skills. So, for instance, I had a roommate my freshman year of college who didn't know how to do laundry. And he actually hired somebody to do laundry for him because he was that unable to do these things. And imagine if you didn't have money or something like that, you might feel inferior because you can't do this. He had the means to do it through other ways, but this idea of pampering can be really bad. However, this doesn't mean we should go neglecting our kids. So we need to kind of have this kind of middle ground. Otherwise, our kids maybe will grow up cold and suspicious, or incapable of warm personal relationships if we neglect them. And how I like to think about this is a bit on a kind of a bell curve or spectrum, what have you. And on one side, we have just extreme pampering of children, and on the other side, we have extreme neglect. And we know that, the vast majority of us likely fall somewhere in kind of the middle here, where yes, our parents spoiled us a little bit, or maybe, hopefully not, yes, our parents neglected us a little bit, but it's not like our parents were at our beck and call all the time, except in some extreme cases, and it's not like most kids are left to be neglected completely. The fact of the matter is, having kind of a healthy balance of these two, not too much pampering and not too much neglect, is going to lead to a healthier child. Now, this wasn't the only thing Adler talked about other than striving for superiority. Interestingly, Adler was a middle child, and he very much was interested in this idea of birth order, And this idea of birth order meaning that which order you were born in your family determines a lot of things. Now, I'm going to talk about how I feel about this at the end of this section, but let's go ahead and start with this idea of firstborn children. Well, Adler believed that firstborn children are going to have excessive attention from their parents, right? This is the first time a parent is learning how to parent. They're probably going to spend a lot of time focused on the kid, making sure everything is going right. I know I am right now. But after that, the second child's going to need a lot of pampering when they're born. So this kid who is pretty used to being the apple of their parents' eye and the only thing, it now has to contend with another creature, another person, right, a sibling that is taking up, right, some of this attention away from them. And this can lead to a strong perception of inferiority, this idea that, oh, I'm not good enough and my parents love them more. And Adler claims that among these firstborn children included people who were neurotic or criminals or drunkards or perverts. And I find that really interesting because we know those problems are not solely for firstborn children. Those can be found in any children, only children, youngest children, middle children, etc. But claiming that these are some tightly wound, I don't want to say personality traits, but kind of personality defects maybe, or issues, is a little silly to me. But then we've got people like middle-born children as well, who develop a strong superiority striving, right? Second-born children are going to try to spend their whole lives catching up to their older siblings who are, obviously or supposedly, faster, smarter, etc., through the developing lifespan. Now, these are going to supposedly be the highest achievers because they're focused on trying to reach that goal, and they're trying to catch up with their older siblings. However, last-born children are going to be pampered throughout their childhood, and the book talks about this as a way of, sometimes people claim that the youngest kid can get away with murder or do whatever they want, and Adler claimed that these kids were very vulnerable to strong inferiority feelings, possibly due to the fact that they might be overly pampered. With the firstborn siblings, we might consider that being an issue with them being maybe neglected, or in their case considered neglected because they went from having all the attention to not all the attention. But generally there's this idea here, and I'm going to throw this up on the screen. You can pause it and look at it. This is something I found online. I thought it was a good way to look at it. It actually also talks about only children who tend to be socially mature. But with birth order, the research doesn't actually tend to back these claims, and there's no actual evidence that birth order affects really adult behaviors or things like that. It likely plays a role, and that's the thing. So one way you can think about this is, if you had a family, one of the things that likely you had, messing with my webcam, is that you likely, if you had siblings, had to deal with some of these feelings at some point. We all probably do. But in the same way, we all have to go shopping for school, or we all have to learn to drive in the same way. It probably affected us somewhat, but for some people, it might have been a huge deal. For other people, it might not have been a big deal at all. And so I don't think it's a thing that's really worth looking at. And I say that as somebody who's talked to a lot of faculty in this department who are interested, or who teach the senior research methods, or the senior project class. And people who do birth order tend to not typically have good results because it's a very muddled and not a very useful measure. So, another thing to think of is I came from a blended family. So I was the oldest child of three, and then I was a middle child all of a sudden. And how would Adler claim that played a role? And that's totally different. So we have to kind of think of that as well. And that, it's not just necessarily the birth order, but the order that your family was raised, especially if you're in kind of a blended family. So Adler did have a lot of very interesting things to add to Freud's theory. However, Freud didn't really like that and kicked him out before any of this, which I found to be really interesting. But generally, I kind of like to think of Adler as somebody who probably struggled with feelings of inferiority his whole life, as he kind of mentions, and they mention in his little biography there. But let's move on to Carl Jung. And Carl Jung is another big name in personality psychology. You hear about Jungian psychology a lot. And he was the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. And actually a disagreement with Freud resulted in, he basically just got kicked out. And this was completely crazy to Freud, because Freud thought that Carl Jung was as they said, his heir apparent, or the kind of next in line for the throne, for the head of psychoanalysis after Freud stepped down or died or whatever. But he ended up establishing analytic psychology, not psychoanalytic, but analytic psychology. And one of the biggest things that Jung talked about was this idea of the collective unconscious. And this collective unconscious is unique from our individual unconscious. It's still part of our unconscious mind, but it comes with these primordial images, as he says. So kind of like primordial, or from like before time. And this constitutes things like thoughts, images, and psychic characteristics, or kind of general schemas or feelings, or kind of ideas that we have that are difficult to bring into awareness. But it's never actually repressed out of consciousness, because it's kind of so low down in there. And more interesting than that people are inheriting these psychic characteristics, although we're not repressing them, we're not aware of them, but they're made up as we said, these primordial images referred to as archetypes. Now, there's a lot of important archetypes in Jungian psychology, but I'm only going to talk about a couple here. We have two that are regarded as the same thing here, the anima and animus. Now, both of these are the exact same thing. It just depends on which gender you're talking about. So the anima is the feminine side of a male, where the animus is the masculine side of a female. So in the sense that as a male, I have an anima, a female would have an animus. And this is a Latin word, right? So if you know the word alumni is plural. And an alumna is a female alumnus, a female alum, and then an alumnus is a male alum. So, right, it comes from that same kind of thing, the A meaning female, the US meaning male. And these actually guide us in finding a romantic partner, because they are kind of the other half of us, and we look to that anima or animus, in my case an anima. So Freud would don't want to know why I keep saying that. Jung would claim that I would look at that anima, that kind of female version of me, or the kind of masculine side of me, and I would look for a female who matched that, and that was going to help me find a romantic partner. And that is what Jung claimed was a major drive in people's choice for romantic partners. Now, not only that, we have what Jung called the shadow, or this negative side of personality, and this is kind of the dark side of you, right? Maybe the kind of you who woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, to a more extreme amount, right? But this guy is actually located in both the personal and collective unconsciousness. And while we only talk about a couple of these, some of the major Jungian archetypes can be seen here, where we talk about this idea of this guy's going to have an anima, right? Because it's a male with a female other half. And then we've got this idea of the shadow, where while this guy is who he is, we can also see the kind of devil inside of him, or this kind of evil portion of him, or I don't want to say evil, but negative. We don't talk about the persona or the self, but those are other aspects of Jungian psychology. If you're interested, go look those up. But when we look at this collective unconscious, we see, so going back to the iceberg examples, we have our ego, we have our levels of consciousness over here, right? Our ego is kind of the who we are, but then we have our personal unconscious, which might be different for somebody. We have a collective unconscious, which we all kind of know about, and this would be those primordial images, or things that Jung claimed was found within mythology or cultural symbols, and interestingly, the statements of schizophrenics, which is interesting for a lot of reasons. And if somebody reminds me during class to mention my personal anecdote about schizophrenics, please let me know, because I think it might play into this a little bit. But Jung argued that the collective unconscious is the same for everyone, and because we see these kind of symbols throughout the world. He said it was right, things like the wise old man or God or the moon and the sun and all of these kind of religious imagery that is found throughout the world, right? Not necessarily in the same areas of the world either. Those are all going to be playing a role in who we are, and those all come from kind of the same, right, collective unconscious that we don't fully recognize. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I'm always bothered by the idea of a collective unconscious. It just seems a little weird. But as Jung says in the book, how is this really any different than instincts, right? Aren't these just generally instincts anyways? The idea that we have these symbols or beliefs or what have you, could we just call those instincts, and would that make, right, me feel a little better? Maybe, but right, it's hard to prove that we have these kind of things, but we know we have instincts as well. So we know we are born with some inward knowledge or some kind of ways to learn that knowledge. Is it that far out there to say that there's other stuff in there? I don't know. But again, that is what Jung would claim. So beyond Jung, we'll talk about Erik Erikson, who is one of my all-time favorite theorists. And I think this is just because this theory of what I would claim now is mostly developmental psychology is really useful in a very interesting way to look at people's lives. So Erik Erikson, not originally last named Erikson, he changed it to be Erikson, which I don't know why. He also kind of looks like Colonel Sanders to me. He believed that the ego is not just this mediator between the superego and the id. He believed that that the ego did its own things and was kind of its own special thing. And so he formed ego psychology. And ego psychology is this idea that really what the ego is doing is maintaining this sense of who we are. That is where this kind of, when we talk about somebody's ego being bruised, kind of right there, that sense of identity is being bruised. Erik Erikson came up with a very frequently misused term called identity crisis, right? And this idea that there's confusion and despair when we lack a strong sense of who we are. And honestly, I taught a class on adjustment theory. And there's an idea that, right, when we are making big adjustments in our lives, we often have these really, like our brains are just thrown into, ourselves are thrown into a completely different sense of understanding of who we are, right? Within 1 week, right, I moved, started my job in the sense I was prepping for it, and then had a baby, right? That's an incredibly unique time to be alive because I'm changing my job. I'm changing my role from student to instructor. I'm changing my role as a parent, and how, right, in a situation like that, there might be some, right, identity crisis here. I wouldn't claim I had one, but I would say that there's a lot of interesting right, kind of logic behind that, right, if these big things happen to us, who am I, right? What does that make me? And trying to understand that, right, how we are and who we are is a huge important thing. Now, one of the most interesting thing about Erikson's theory, in my opinion, is the idea that this is more or less the first theory of personality that extends the full lifespan and assumes that we change across the full lifespan. Freud thought our personalities were done basically by the time we were 6. Right here, we are talking between more or less like birth to 65 plus, and how we change throughout this settings. And during these changes in our lives, we might go through what Erik Erikson called crises, or these turning points encountered by people in personality development. So kind of a choice almost. And these kind of provide 2 directions in which to proceed. So they can proceed down what we consider a positive route or a negative route. And we'll talk about those. And how we actually resolve a crisis determines how we continue down that line. And it's not always the case that we make the right decisions. And Erik Erikson believed what we needed to do to correct those issues was do psychotherapy and relearn the correct style of thinking on each one of these. Now, I have these set up here a little bit like I saw this picture online. I thought it was really nice. We're going to start off with infancy, And we're going to work our way all the way around the circle to maturity, but understanding how each of these areas contains a different question we have to ask and a different question we have to learn to be a good or kind of healthy human. And the first one we'll talk about happens during infancy, in the first 18 months of life. And it's this idea of, who do we trust? Can we trust people, or should we be mistrusting of others? So this is this idea of basic trust versus mistrust. So, are we going to be able to trust the people around us, or should we not trust them? Here we have some trust being built right now, and children whose needs are met mostly through when they're crying being consoled, or when they're crying being fed, or what have you, are going to learn this sense of basic trust. But if I were to take my daughter and just ignore her every time she cried, eventually she might learn the idea that nobody's going to come get me, so why should I trust you to do anything for me? And this is the first 18 months of life that this happens, right? When a baby is the most helpless, as Adler would talk about, right? That these creatures, these children need other people to take care of them, and they have to trust that they will be taken care of correctly. And after about the first 18 months to about 2 years old, or 2 to 3 years old, this is when kids start to either learn autonomous behaviors, so the idea that they are able to manipulate and control what they encounter, versus shame and doubt. So the idea is that people who have a sense of autonomy are going to be very self-confident because they believe that, hey, I can do these things. I have my ability to do these things. But say you're with a parent who constantly says, no, don't do that, right? Why would you do that? That's terrible. You're going to maybe get feelings of shame and doubt. Why am I doing this? Right? Like, my kid's at this stage where pretty soon she's going to start just putting things, she's going to just start grabbing things and then exploring them with her mouth, more or less, right? Freud's psychosexual stage being oral here. But the idea here is that once they start getting to that point where they're able to explore and try new things, it's probably useful for kids to learn that they can do these things and not necessarily rely on their parents and not feel shameful or doubting in their abilities to do these things. And children become dependent on others if they kind of fall into the shame versus doubt area. Afterwards, we move on to this initiative versus guilt idea. And so the idea here is that, kind of building on that autonomy idea, right? Kids start to learn, right? If when they're doing these things, starting to, do social activities from 3 to 5, start to develop a sense of, I want to do these specific things. But if kids maybe don't have that ability, they might start to feel guilty or resign themselves to almost not doing anything because, hey, why should I have initiative? So this is going to be an important stage. Well, they're all important. The next one is from 6 years old to 11 years old, or about the time Freud would claim the latent stage kicked in. And this is this idea of industry versus inferiority. So industry is a very weird word to use here, but I think it's more of a sign of the times. It's the idea that our belief in our own strengths and abilities. So if we are, achieving tasks and even if our parents are helping us in learning how to do things well, we're going to be industrious, we're going to be prosperous, or maybe not prosperous is the right word, but productive members of society at this point. But if considering some of the other stages, if you're feeling shameful or guilty, you might begin to feel inferior in your belief that you are not able to do so good. And, this sounds a lot like, the inferiority complex that Adler talked about. So, again, all of these theorists are still coming from the same kind of rooted system in Freud's psychoanalysis. So we will see some of this come up and up, right? And when children encounter failure that they can't overcome, this is when we're going to see things like inferiority. Now, more or less the next couple roles are when we really start to get towards teenagerhood and adulthood. From about 12 to 18, we go into this idea of identity versus role confusion. Right? So the idea is during this time, we are learning how to be who we are, right? Make decisions about who you are. They talk about religion a lot in this chapter, which I found interesting, and I'm going to kind of steer clear of that. We can talk about it during class if you have questions, but failing to develop a strong sense of identity leads to people's role confusion, right? I don't know who I am. So if you are, right, maybe I don't want to say babied or kind of like you have a helicopter parent and who's not allowing you to go outside, who's not allowing you to kind of be social, you might kind of lack a sense of who you are. And I think a big thing that a lot of teenagers and adults go through is an idea of defining that ego and their sense of identity. And I think a lot of people don't really know how to deal with these things like role confusion and figuring out their identity. I think we're really bad as a society in teaching that, but that's my own kind of self thoughts. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, one thing to recognize with this is that more recent research has shown us that this whole stage is actually being moved further down the line till maybe about 25 to 12 to 25 until we kind of figure out who we are. Why is this? We spend a lot more time in school now. We spend a lot more time kind of growing. Young adulthood is a great time for people to figure out who they are when they're away from their parents. And so this has almost shifted a little bit in more recent times to be a little bit later in development as well. But after this, we come to this idea of intimacy versus isolation. And so younger people, they say 19 to 40, I would say probably like between 19 to 25 and 40, these people start to search for a relationship in kind of an emotionally a romantic relationship and able to be intimate in the sense of both, I guess, physical intimacy, but more this kind of emotional intimacy or closeness with other people. And people who don't do that tend to face emotional isolation. You're coming to this question of, do I deserve to be loved towards the end of that? Now, after that comes this idea of generativity versus stagnation. So, am I spinning my wheels doing what I'm doing? Am I working in the middle of a corporate ladder that I'm not really doing anything that's useful? Or am I starting to, what is my what is my life worth? Is it, am I doing good things? And mostly this is seen as parents raising their children. However, we see this in other things, Adults without children play an active role in raising nieces and nephews. They can do other things regarding, volunteering, working at a church, etc. But adults who fail to do this generativity tend to suffer from stagnation, the idea that they're just kind of not doing anything with their life. They're just kind of sitting there. And that's not useful. We don't want people to feel that way. So, definitely figuring out, is my life something that has kind of been a net positive on the world? And then we lead to this idea of ego integrity versus despair. And so is this idea that, kind of building on that last one, how was my life? I'm coming towards the end of it. Was it a satisfying life? Was it a life that made me feel like I did the good things in it? Or, do you start to feel a sense of despair in this idea that you are, that you lived a bad life, or that now it's all going to catch up with you? And that's a really interesting way to perceive this. And this is this idea that maybe throughout our life's journeys, we're asking these specific questions about ourselves. And so Erik Erikson took all of these based on research that he did, and research has continued to be done to understand this very well. Now, the last theorist we're going to talk about is the first female theorist, and actually a really badass woman, the more I was reading about her, Karen Horney. And if you have trouble pronouncing that, it's Horney, not Horny or Horney, as I was saying. What I found really interesting about this was, she studied Freud's work and taught psychoanalysis, and was huge in bringing psychoanalysis to America. And she, is very big into this word neuroses, as we talk about, in this idea of feminine psychology. And I think this is something that is probably a lot more appreciated today now than back then, this idea of feminine psychology, which we'll talk a little bit about. I really like this comic here, which I'm not going to read, but it's the idea that, hey, it doesn't seem to just be about men right? Women are also doing other things here as well. And I think a lot of the research has come around to say that Horney had a lot of really good ideas. But one of the biggest ones that she talks about is this idea of neuroses. And so neuroticism or neuroses here, when we talk about this with the Big Five model, where a lot of people hear this term neurotic, it doesn't exactly mean the same thing. So when we talk about this neuroses in terms of psychoanalysis, and we talk about this in terms of Horney, we're talking about this idea of almost this self-defeating interpersonal style. I like to think of, well, what's his name? Eeyore is his name. I like to think of Eeyore as somebody who's kind of just like thinks they're, I don't want to say depressed, but maybe just, thinks they're not a good person, thinks that they can't do things well. And this is going to be terrible for somebody because it prevents us from being able to develop the social contact that we crave. And we know that human beings crave social contact, and social contact is very good for human beings. And what happens to some people is a destructive interpersonal style, which is actually just a defense mechanism to ward off feelings of anxiety. And so how we deal with people to make us less anxious. And this is due to disturbed interpersonal relationships during childhood. So kind of in a different way, how your parents maybe raised you can determine how if a neurotic person is going to deal with others. And so she talked about three different ones, the first of which is this idea of moving towards people. And the idea behind moving towards people is kind of becoming very close and overly attached. I think about like the overly attached girlfriend meme down below is somebody who is going to be very quick to be your best friend and probably maybe a little clingy. I love this, like compulsively seeking affection and acceptance from their parents and caregivers and partners, actually. But there's some other ones as well, this idea of moving against people. And so this is actually, I like to think of it, instead of moving towards people, moving like in the way of people. And we see this as kind of people who are aggressive, hostile, and oftentimes maybe like thinking that you're going to hurt them before, and so they ought to hurt you before you hurt them. I like to think of these as kind of your typical bullies, or your classic example of a bully. And then there's the example of moving away from people. And while we can move against people, right, like and be a contrarian, we can also move away from people in the sense that, right, these people just kind of like to be alone. And now it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing. And I don't want to say like, hey, people who are loners are bad, or I don't want to say, hey, people who are loners are good, but I want to say that, right, making sure that people who are lonely, or people who are alone are not lonely is a different thing. But, if, somebody who's going to move away from people might do so because they feel like their needs aren't going to be met, or they're the people that they do meet always let them down, or something of this sort, which is not healthy. But on the other hand, people who enjoy their time alone, that's not a terrible thing either. But that's some stuff about the neuroses. But let's talk for a minute about the feminine psychology example. And so where Freud brought in this idea of penis envy, we have Horney coming out with this idea of womb envy, this idea that because women have a womb and can bear children and nurse them, that men are somehow going to compensate for this inability to have children through other achievements. That, hey, you can't create life, men, so you're going to try to do something else to make it like that. I like this quote from her, right? It's not the tremendous strength in men of the impulse to create, not the tremendous strength in men of the impulse to creative work in every field, precisely due to their feeling of playing a relatively small part in the creation of living beings, which constantly impels them to an overcompensation in achievement. I like this because it's really going back to that point. Is it the case where this is more of just a cultural phenomenon? And Karen Horney also talks about this idea that, like, well, but what about the fact that women are just treated worse than men? And right, women are not allowed to go to college as frequently as men back in the day. And right, Karen Horney had to fight to get her degrees because most universities didn't even accept women back then. right? And she claimed that it's less about women, right, wanting to, right, having penis envy, and it's probably a lot more about women wanting to, oh, I don't know, be treated equal or something. Crazy, I know. But one thing that this doesn't explain is this idea of, right, transgenderism, or the idea of homosexuality, and that, right, you could possibly, right, argue, right, that we are not living in a society where men and women are free to become whatever they desire. But you would expect that, right, based on this, that girls would not want to ever be boys, nor boys would want to be girls, which, right, is not exactly what we know to be true today. So those are our four major theorists, and that's a kind of quick overview of them. The book goes into some more detail. But the one specific thing that they all kind of used, and the book talks about, is this idea of personal narratives, or narrating one's own life story. So if your life was a book and you were writing it, what kind of scenes, what kind of things would you be adding to them here? And so we know that, right, these are frequently done through interviews, and we can record and transcribe these what people say, code them based on criteria, and scores tend to be consistent over time. And I think this is a really nice way to examine what people think about who they are in themselves, because, right, what is the narrative that you tell yourself? However, we do have to recognize not everybody is is going to be 100% truthful in what they say, and we do have a bias to want to be good people. But interestingly, though, the generativity in life stories is a really unique aspect I want to spend some time on. And this is one really cool way in which we can use this idea of personal narratives to study how these personalities, right, kind of play a role. So this idea of generativity versus stagnation, which would be that kind of middle-aged area of Erikson's discussion on, right, our personality. So Erik Erikson did use these ideas of personal narratives in personality development, and what he had them do was just reflect or kind of describe stories, especially in the elderly, from each generation of, or from each 10-year period of their lives. So, right, think about, give me a story or a personal narrative of one thing you remember very vividly under 10, between 10 and 20, between 20 and 30, 40 and 50, kind of moving up. And what is interesting is that people's ideas about generativity increase during this kind of midlife decades, about when Erikson claims this is happening. And the stories from highly generative adults, so people who have kind of successfully completed this, they talk about things like, right, their friendships, sharing, right, parts of their lives, affiliation, being close to others, maybe that being, right, their spouse, their work, their social lives, their community, and this idea of nurturing other people. And you can see this pretty clearly here as well. And this is a really cool way in which we can study what kind of stages people are kind of at, and when they are at those stages. So the last thing I want to talk about quickly is the strengths and criticisms of the Neo-Freudian theories, and they're pretty great because they elaborate on a lot of things that Freud did, but, and they also say it in a way that makes a little bit more sense than Freud, if you ask me. They identified the fact that these social factors are a huge deal. It's not just your parents screwing you up. It's not just psychosexual stages of development. It's not just the libido in the tree. It's a lot of other things. I might be a little biased, though, as I am a social psychologist. I do think that, right, social factors influence personality. You might disagree. But I also like the fact that, as the book says, this is an optimistic picture of humankind, a rarity for psychoanalysis. This idea is that, hey, there's actually some good going on, and we're striving to be good people. And we saw a lot of concepts that were introduced that have been co-opted by, I would say, kind of the mainstream, but also useful things, right? Introvertedness, identity crises, inferiority complexes, which have stood the test of time in the same way that Freud's concept of the unconscious has. Now, lastly, there's a couple criticisms, of course, right? It's questionable on the evidence for some of these things, like how exactly are we going to figure out the collective unconscious. I mean, I guess we can look at different traditions that people have had all over the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's correct. But it is one way to do this, and it oversimplified or ignored a lot of important concepts which have been elaborated on in the future. But again, remember the timing of a lot of these. Although wasn't Jung, I forget who, but I think Erik Erikson died in 1994. So like we are talking not too long ago in reality. But these kind of are still the maybe we would call this the second generation of theories of personality. So still talking about very important stuff, but not really digging into it completely. That's all the information I'm going to go over today. I want you guys to make sure you're keeping up with the materials. Remember that exam is going to be due by the end of the coming week. I guess you would say before we meet for the Chapter 6 portion of the class. If you have any questions, let me know. Stop by office hours, whatever you need. Other than that, have a great day. Hope you're all well, and enjoy.